Good evening, and welcome to the culminating event for the 2021 Progressive Conservative Summit. My name is Brent Holmes, and I'm the Acting Director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center staff and our partners, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and the Progressive Women's Alliance, thank you for joining us this evening. I have the honor of introducing tonight's main event. You may have heard this one. A conservative, a progressive, and a libertarian walk onto a stage. They engage in robust discussion. No, this is not a joke, but we do have the bouncers in the back just in case it gets rowdy. Tonight on stage we have Jane Coaston, Matthew Iglesias, and David French. I will keep introductions brief, as I hope many of you got to know our speakers during their individual keynotes. Jane is an experienced political reporter and currently the host of The Argument for the New York Times. Just as her keynote was focused around, Jane will moderate tonight's good faith discussion between Matthew and David. Matthew is the co-founder of the popular news website Vox and host The Weeds. More recently, he has begun the Substack, The Slow Boring. Last but not least, David joins us. He's the senior editor at The Dispatch and is a columnist for Time. David is also a brother in arms, having served as a major in the United States Army Reserve and a fellow veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Please help me welcome these three thought leaders to the stage and engage in a discussion we have all been waiting for. Thank you.
All right, first and foremost, go blue. It's the most important thing I could say today. Exactly.
Minor league football is interesting.
See, that's where the debate begins. I want to start out by, we've been brought here to have a conversation using good faith debate, but also about good faith debate. So for both of you, you've been participating in the intellectual realm for a long time now, as you're both much older than I am. I am interested to see from you, David, and you, Matt, was there a point where we were better at doing this? Has something gone wrong? I've been thinking about this because I was asked during my Zoom presentation, or my presentation yesterday, you know, what went, like, have we always been like this? What went wrong? And I would say that, like, yes and no. So I'm curious, David, what do you think has gone wrong in how we have debate and how we have these conversations?
You know, I cannot remember in my life, I think I'm the oldest one on the stage, I don't remember a golden era of public discourse. I just don't. I mean, I do remember an era where it's maybe a little more substantive. I was talking in the speech this morning where I can remember going to Vanderbilt when I was in college in Tennessee, and I would go to Vanderbilt and there would be a packed auditorium of 2,000 people to hear a debate about the MX missile. It's like, that's substance. But it was very angry. It was very robust. And so I do think my entire life, what I have seen is that there has been really robust and often aggressive debate. The change that I think is that is now part of not just this talking head culture, but the culture more broadly. And then also the other thing is it feels like it's gotten more deeply personal. You know, there was sort of there's this sort of green room culture that often exists where people get together and they talk about their kids and Little League Baseball, and then they have their 8-minute TV hit and they go at it, and then after but for people watching it, they never saw the green room.
Right.
All they saw was the 8 minutes, and all they saw was that back and forth. And I think that then what has happened since is that we don't have that green room culture anymore. The fight continues onto Twitter. The fight, then it spills over into families. And so it just feels like we have aggressive partisanship like we've had for a long time, but it's so much more pervasive.
Matt, what do you think? What do you think has changed?
Well, so I do think two important things have changed. One is that we have more perfect sorting of people, right? So instead of saying, okay, here's a debate about the MX missile, and it's going to be a vicious debate, but it's really going to be about the MX missile, now everybody's views on everything are correlated with their views on everything else. So our debates are much more totalizing rather than sort of specific. And you know so much about a person if just you kind of know what side they're on. A secondary factor is social media, has a distinctive influence on the public square. And one of its influences is to try to further enforce those boundaries, right? Rather than being a writer who has a job at a publication and you put your ideas out into the world after consultation with your editor, instead, whatever you say, people go yell at you, right? And if the people who yell at you are the people who are like supposed to be your guys, that's a very stressful experience for a lot of people. I think especially young writers find it to be just very unpleasant to do something that produces a negative response from their kind of corner of the world, right? And people don't want to have unpleasant experiences. Journalism is like not necessarily a super remunerative field, but it's really fun. It's like a really great job, but people like want it to be fun, right? So things that when I was younger, editors would really encourage you to kind of like stir the pot a little bit, to try to challenge people, to try to be a little counterintuitive. There's now so much pressure, I think, on people to not do that, which has further created this kind of vicious debate. I used to really hate the show Crossfire because Crossfire, by its nature, you had to have the right and the left, and they had to be arguing. And other forms of media were not quite like that. But now I think everything is Crossfire all the time, like structured as we're going to fight to the death.
Do you think, I'm curious for both of you, something that you brought up with the idea of social media is that you become on social media your viewpoints. So you are not Matthew Iglesias, you're Matthew Iglesias who thinks these things.
Yeah.
How has that changed the work that you do? And has that in any way influenced your views on the stuff that you are working on?
I don't think so. I'm a jerk and, I don't care what people say. But I think that, it is social, right? Like people call it social media and it's social. And it encourages the kind of behaviors that you see in social settings, right? Where like people have like teams, right? And people have little tribes. And there are these like incredibly obscure feuds that are out there. And people will, if I say something, somebody will be like, aha, but 9 years ago you said this thing, which screenshotted without context seems really dumb. And it's like, I don't know, man. It's like we're enemies, right? Like we're not actually arguing about the thing that I said. We're just having a kind of a battle, right? Because you don't like me. Which is a social phenomenon rather than an intellectual phenomenon, which is like, let me read the words on the page and try to respond to them.
I'm curious, David, you brought up the idea of green room culture. And I think that something that during Trump's election in 2015, 2016, I was thinking about is that in some ways, the people who gravitated towards him, they didn't hate the arguing. They hated the green room culture.
Yes,
the idea
100%.
that at the end of the day, you get together and shake hands and talk about your grandkids.
Yes, they hated that. And what I think began to leak into people was this idea that a lot of what they were seeing was like watching the WWE. That it was a performance. This was something that, and they didn't really mean it. And they wanted people to really mean it. The problem is, if you really meant all that anger, then that was going to do something to us. That was going to do something to the country. And it's doing something to the country. But yeah, I remember growing up in the South, we had all these arguments over whether wrestling was real. Because, there's the sport of wrestling,
Yes.
and then there's wrestling.
Right.
Was wrestling real? And people began to realize that what was happening on cable news wasn't real until it started to become real. And then the other thing I think that Matthew said that is really important is to understand how deeply disorienting it is, especially for somebody who's younger, to receive incoming fire from their own team. It is very deeply disorienting. It is very distressing. You're sort of raised to, if you're in the world of ideas, to almost glory in the opposition of your opponents. That's great. That's a bullet point on your CV if you've triggered the other side. But to get incoming from your own side can be deeply disorienting. And then in this era of hyperpolarization, the critique aimed at in-group dissenters isn't, I disagree with your ideas. It's even beyond, you're a bad person. It's, you're a traitor. You are Benedict Arnold in this existential struggle for the soul of the nation. And I was talking to somebody, a person who had been doing a lot of work in civil strife in developing countries. And she said, one of the signs of heightening possibility of civil strife is increasing animosity towards in-group dissenters. It's clearing the decks for the titanic struggle. And that's what we, particularly coming from the right side of the spectrum where I am, if you're somebody who has vocally, and you have a public presence, vocally opposed Donald Trump or vocally said that the election wasn't stolen, it's almost a guarantee, if you've reached a certain level, that you will have faced rather serious and very troubling threats to your life or livelihood. And that's something that was not as common 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
I'm curious though, because I think that the challenge that we have, and I'm interested to get your thoughts, Matt, is you raise the tension so high, and then you tell people that the only way they can deal with it is to vote. So you have like, the world is falling apart. You have to vote in this particular way. There's no bill that's more important than this one. There's no election that's no more important than this one. I'm interested in, Matt, how do we, if we can ratchet down the tensions, that would be great, but also how can we make this, like how can we communicate to voters the actual stakes without relying on that type of rhetoric? Because I think that it's bad.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's challenging, right? The American political system is structured around this zero-sum competition for the presidency, right? Now, not that much changed between 2012, 2016, 2020 about the like basic structure of American public opinion. But there's this huge swing. Barack Obama was president, then Donald Trump was president, then Joe Biden was president. These small moves in public opinion or in voting behavior generate these big swings in executive authority. And then we exaggerate the significance of the president in our system. But he is very significant in our system, and it's symbolically significant. I mean, people I know faced so much emotional distress from Donald Trump being president. And I'm not talking about, I mean, there are people who lost Medicaid benefits because of waivers he wrote. There are people who had family members deported because of policy changes Trump made. But the people I know, the like bougie liberals in Logan Circle in Washington, D.C., they were not personally suffering from Donald Trump's policies. We had our taxes cut. It was fine, but like it wasn't fine, right? People felt themselves to be under a psychic assault from the existence, the elevation of a man who they saw as abnegating the values that were important to them. And that's a hard way to do politics, you know? Like it can't be the case that everyone's favorite guy is president simultaneously. It's a diverse society, and in Congress we have a diverse representation. You know, there's hundreds of House members, all different kinds, right? Like there's AOC, there's Josh Gottheimer, there's Republicans, and like the median member of Congress is always pretty moderate. It's kind of nice, but we don't have a legislature-focused politics, and certainly not a legislature-focused political mentality, so it makes politics very stressful and hard to deal with in a rational way.
You just triggered one of my most passionate album sides about our systemic problems, which is the 100-year inversion of the American system from a Congress is supreme to a president is supreme. As I said in the morning session, the phrase co-equal branches of government that's triggering to me. They are not intended to be co-equal branches of government. Congress, they can check each other, but that's not the same thing as saying they are of equal power. Congress has the power of the purse. Congress, in theory, or it used to, have the power to declare war, sole authority to declare war. Congress can fire the president. Congress can fire the justices of the Supreme Court. But in this current system, what we've done is we've concentrated so much power in the executive that it's just exactly what Matt said, is that every 4 years, it's not that it's the most important election of our lifetimes, but we are electing the most powerful, arguably most powerful peacetime president in American history, because that executive power just keeps on accumulating. And so the stakes just feel sometimes almost absurdly high. From a policy standpoint, yes, but also psychically, emotionally, the stakes are ridiculously high. And that's supposed to be, we're heading back towards the exact kind of structure of government that the founders wanted to avoid, which was packing so much, not just raw political power, but cultural power, emotional power. That's like what a sovereign has. A sovereign has, they're the head of the state, they're the head of the army, they're the head of the government, you name it, and that was what we're trying to avoid, and that's what we are slowly but surely recreating every 4 years, or we're slowly working to build towards about every 4 years.
Do you think, I'm curious thinking about that, do you think that part of that has to do with the powers that the president has always had? Because I think that the focus on specifically the Supreme Court, where you've heard that in 2016, a lot of Republicans basically were like, we are in this for the Supreme Court with the intention that the Supreme Court will do these things. Which, as a side note, is a very amusing argument regarding the Supreme Court, because people try to pretend as if they're not thinking about Supreme Court justices as if they'll vote the way they want them to. And then you have rulings like Bostock, and you're like, how dare did they rule in this way I didn't want them to? And they sound all offended. It's funny to me. But I am curious as to, not even with the expansion of executive powers, but with the powers of nominating Supreme Court justices, or the powers that were given to the president initially, were those powers part of the problem too?
Well, I would say that the president unquestionably has a lot of inherent authority, whether or not we're going to get into sort of unitary executive theory or not. But it has a lot of inherent authority. But what it also had was the ability to fill a vacuum. And so when Congress, for example, legislates in a particular way, where it leaves gaps that the executive branch is supposed to fill in, well, then the executive branch is going to fill that in. When there's quote unquote gridlock, that one of the things that Obama said about immigration was Congress has failed to act. Well, now I'm going to act. Well, as a matter of constitutional law, that's not how that works. As a matter of pure politics, that's compelling to an awful lot of people, and that's the very popularity of that move has its own power. And so I think that when you're talking about legislative abdication of power, the most logical branch to come galloping in to fill that vacuum is the executive branch, because it does have a lot of inherent authority under the Constitution.
I'm interested to hear, because I want to talk a little bit about something that you both have talked about and that I've also written on, which is educational polarization. Mm-hmm. Matt, you wrote a really interesting piece for your Substack, which is great. I highly recommend subscribing, but it's called Education Polarization is Only Growing, and it's Making Everyone Mad All the Time. Can you explain where that came from and what you were talking about?
Yeah, so we have seen a really strong acceleration over the past several years of education polarization, of the tendency for college graduates, and especially graduates of elite schools, and especially people with graduate degrees, to go to the left. And less educated people have gone to the right. And for a little while, these movements were limited to the white population, and Democrats were still very, very strong with working class African American and Latino voters. But in the past 4 years, we saw bleed of Latino especially, but also African American working class people to Trump, but even more college graduates going to Biden, going to the Democratic Party. And one consequence of that is that society has always relied on educated professionals to lead institutions, right? And to run things, that you need medical doctors and public health experts and economists. There's a lot of technical aspects to governance. Conservatives have both pushed technical experts out of the Republican Party by disrespecting expertise, but also now feel rightly that neutral expert institutions are hostile to them and their values and their projects, which further incentivizes them to reject the idea of expertise. And it's creating a situation in which I think it's increasingly challenging to assemble like technically competent conservative government, but it doesn't change the fact that half the people are Republicans. And the way our maps are drawn, actually, Republicans have a big advantage because college graduates are concentrated in a handful of states and cities. So, you know, we're looking at a society in which the leadership cadres of like everything are being crowded into one party, which is at a steep electoral disadvantage, and it's going to be disproportionately surrendering the baton to a group of people who are going to essentially have like nincompoops running the government. And it's very, I think, like unhealthy for society. It is frustrating Democrats' desire to win elections and get to pass laws, but I think it's also frustrating what conservatives really care about, which I think is not actually that focused on legislation, but more focused on their role and standing and respect in American society. And you can tell conservatives are very upset at the idea that elite institutions don't like them and don't want them, but they're also not like doing anything to win the respect of institutions like that, and quite the opposite, going all in on conspiracy theories and other weird stuff. And I just think it's a very unhealthy moment for our society.
You've talked about this, but I do want to note something, which is at the top of Matt's piece notes that a Harvard Crimson survey of the incoming Harvard class of 2025 revealed that 87% of the class voted for Joe Biden, as compared to 6.7% for Howie Hawkins and 6.3% for Donald Trump. I think before you answer, would that have been different if it wouldn't have been Donald Trump? Because I am interested in like, I'm pretty sure that most Harvard incoming freshmen would have voted for a Democrat. I'm pretty sure the fact that the Republican was Donald Trump had played some part in this.
It'd be a little different, but not substantially. I think that some of the statistics showed that when Obama was running against Romney in 2012, and I can't remember them off the top of my head, but Obama was somewhere around 79, 80% of the choice of the Harvard incoming freshman at that time. So there was more. I mean, it wasn't that the GOP nominee was finishing third behind the Green Party nominee, which is pretty extreme. But you know, one of the things I think that, and I actually, Matt's piece really impacted me, and I wrote something inspired in part by Matt's piece, because I think there's something on this education point that some folks are missing, and that is elite education, the Harvards, the Yales, the Browns, the Dartmouths, and the Ivies and the near Ivies are hyper-concentrated with left-wing students, hyper-concentrated. And it's not that the students get there as part of an American cross-section and then become left-wing. They are coming in the door left-wing. That is not the case where my kids go to school. My older two kids go to the University of Tennessee, and 3 weeks ago I was there at Neyland Stadium where we were playing University of Pittsburgh, or playing Pittsburgh, and about 7 or 8 times the student body initiated an F Joe Biden chant. So this is the student body. So what you have is a situation where you've got a lot of people graduating from big Southern schools, big Midwestern schools, going on to having quite prosperous lives, doing really well for themselves. I mean, my neighborhood in Williamson County, Tennessee is a really prosperous neighborhood, and it's Ole Miss grad, UT grad, Alabama grad, Auburn grad. During football season, I don't know how we can make it without bloodshed, but these are people doing really, really well. But they're not at Apple. They're not at Harvard. They're not at, they're not in Hollywood. And so there's this really interesting thing that's happening where you have a lot of people who are quite educated, quite accomplished, quite prosperous, quite respected in their communities, quite powerful in their communities, feeling a deep sense of resentment against a larger cultural elite that they sort of feel shut out of. Now, it's not that they even really tried to get into it, to be clear. But one thing I want to say about elites in the GOP, this complete shunning of expertise is not the conservative movement I grew up in. This sort of notion that education is inherently that sort of policy expertise and all of that. That is not the wing of the conservative movement I grew up in. I grew up in the legal part of the conservative movement, and there was an extreme emphasis on scholarship, extreme emphasis on intellectual rigor. I grew up in the Cold War when there was deep and interesting and extreme amount of intellectual expertise around foreign policy, around military policy. I think we're in a phase of the GOP that I hope ends, but one that I think Matt is accurately characterizing, but is not inherent to the conservative movement. It is part of the battle for the conservative movement.
But I'm interested in that, and because I want to ask Matt about something else related to this subject. But yes, the conservative movement has been tied to this intellectual tradition, but the conservative movement has also been tied to rejecting that intellectual tradition. You have William F. Buckley, who went to Yale, who writes God ran at Yale, and then in 1961 says, I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the telephone directory than by the Harvard University faculty. And this is a dude who went to Yale.
Well, he's at Harvard.
I want to draw a distinction there, though, in defense of the older version of the conservative movement. So I think Buckley represents a pretty integral part of conservative thinking, which is a suspicion of intellectuals, right, as a group, as a class. But I think that, as David says, traditionally there was a view that technical expertise was important. And so, when I was in college, one of my classes was taught by Greg Mankiw, who is an accomplished academic economist, and he worked in the George W. Bush administration. One of my professors was a guy named Stephen Peter Rosen, who is a political scientist, but he served in the Reagan administration. He's a defense guy, and he would tell you all about tanks and what they did in the Korean War, right? And so there was a view that this kind of techne was important, paired with a suspicion of intellectuals as useless and out of touch or weird and alien to religion and family and normal decent conservative values. But I think that has metastasized, and you saw in the 90s, right, you had scientists who were being smoking cigarettes gives you cancer and it kills people, and companies don't want to be regulated. Republicans tend to be sympathetic to businesses who don't want to be regulated. Tobacco farmers tended to live in the South, be in conservative areas. So there was a natural affinity between the Republican Party and wanting to believe that the scientists were wrong about this. But in fact, they were right. And ultimately that view prevailed, I think, nationally in a reasonably consensus way. But over time, I think it's become more and more eroded, that just idea that something you don't want to hear might be true anyway has really been brushed out of Republican politics. And unfortunately, though, I don't think it's made Democrats better to accomplish this monopoly on the intellectual classes. If anything, it's also made them worse, because you don't have meaningful debate and dialogue and experts on both sides and a real range of views and an airing of issues. It's just become this very unhealthy dynamic dominated by resentments and posturing.
Can I just build on that for a second? Let's go into the world of military policy, which used to be a home of a lot of conservative intellectual thought and debate. So in the Bush administration from 2000 to 2008, there was a real interesting debate between competing strands of military strategy and thought. One camp dominated by Donald Rumsfeld, another camp that was ultimately sort of overtaken by the General Petraeus view of counterinsurgency. This was a serious intellectual debate that had massive real-world consequences, just massive real-world consequences.
Yeah, a lot of people died. Yeah.
Well, and
that happens.
There's no question about that's what happens in war, but it had massive consequences for the course of the war. It had massive consequences for the defense of the United States after 9/11. So then you fast forward, what's the critique that's coming from the right and as the Afghan war is winding down? The dominant critique isn't about counterinsurgency doctrine. The dominant critique isn't about working with allies and human terrain and all the kinds of arguments that we had. It was woke generals know how to do diversity training, and they can't win a war. When if you actually like drill down and you're talking to someone in the Pentagon and you hear that they're talking about this critique of woke generals can't win a war, they're thinking, what are you talking about? You know, you have a half a day of PowerPoint slides and that means our F-22 squadrons aren't achieving readiness? I mean, that's insane. What kind of wokeness was brought into Afghanistan? I mean, this is just insanity, but it's all culture war scoring, point scoring, and it's just an absolute sort of collapse on the right side of the aisle of a coherent kind of intellectual argument that has real consequences about how this country is governed and how, in the course of world history, when people in the right do achieve power.
I'm curious as to, because we've been talking about conservatism, and I want to get at some conversations about conservative policy building, because Matt, you write in your piece essentially that like conservative policy doesn't seem to exist when it just is like, well, we're fine with this and we're fine with that too. But I'm interested of what does this mean for the Democratic Party? Because something I keep thinking about is that the Democratic Party during the Trump years attempted or sort of became a bigger tent than perhaps they intended to be, because you had a host of people who were like, well, I'm certainly not voting for that. But when you're attempting to have a political project such as it exists that's supposed to contain people who are thinking of themselves as being very much on the left, so they hate Democrats, but they still vote for Democrats, and you have people who are more centrist, who are Democrats but also don't like other Democrats. I'm curious as to how you think that political project can move forward.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the Democrats traditionally were the liberal party, but liberals were a minority strand within the Democratic Party, which was mostly a moderate political party that kind of had a liberal wing. And that has inverted over the past few years. It has become a, you know, pretty thoroughly liberal party that then has a few moderates that are putting them over the top narrowly in the legislature. And it is awkward. The Democratic Party has always been, I think, a little bit awkward in that sense. But, you know, it's, if anything, if you look at this legislative debate that's coming up, Democrats do not have a paucity of policy ideas. If anything, they have too many and are not like editing themselves in a way to say, look, like we want to do a countable number of things such that we can tell people what those things are and why it is we're doing them. About, you know, most of the stuff that's in this reconciliation bill, like the reason it's in there is that it is some kind of longstanding progressive goal. It's not addressing some specific, here's 2021, like here's what I'm gonna do for you, here's this kind of reason that we have for it. And I mean, I think you just see that like it doesn't work. The numbers aren't there to govern that way. There are not that many ideological liberals in America. There are more than there used to be, but it's like nowhere near 50%. And, you know, Democrats to govern, to do politics and to govern, need to be in touch with that reality, that they need to win a large majority of self-identified moderates in order to win elections, and then they need to govern that way. You know, like Biden like had the moderate brand, but all along I wrote these pieces, but like his campaign proposals were kind of like surprisingly aggressive related to Biden's rep. And he won the election fair and square, so I mean, he's entitled to go for it. But I think most people's understanding of him was as somebody who probably wouldn't pursue an incredibly ambitious progressive legislative agenda, even though, I mean, again, to be clear, it was always up on the website and I was doing the takes. But I don't think that was his image. And I don't think it's a surprise that his numbers have dropped a lot as people have been going like, wow, what's this sweeping Biden policy agenda? Like, I thought we were gonna get rid of the crazy tweets and try to handle COVID in a responsible way.
Do you think part of that, and I think that this gets, and we'll talk about policy in a minute, I think that this gets to something I've been thinking about a lot, which is how social media offers an audience to politics, and that audience is often not terribly helpful. I wrote a piece in 2020 about how Donald Trump's campaign was excessively online. And what I meant is not like, oh, he did a lot of stuff on Twitter. What I meant was that what he talked about at campaign rallies would be like, oh, did you hear what happened to Bruce Orr today? And I remember I was like, who the hell is Bruce Orr? I had written a piece on this person who's involved in the Russia stuff, but I had forgotten who they were. And I think you saw that, like that Joe Biden didn't talk about stuff that was on Twitter all that much. But now you have a Democratic Party that is incredibly online. Well, the upper echelons of that are online. So do you think, Matt, that because of that, in some ways, people are misreading the electorate in that way, in a way that Joe Biden didn't do during the election?
Yeah, I mean, my new political hero, Eric Adams, he said at his victory party, elections are won by people on Social Security, not by people on social media. And I think that's really true. I'm very flattered every time I get a little heart on Twitter from Ron Klain. But I also wonder why
is
the
he
White
doing
House Chief of Staff is spending so much time on Twitter bestowing little hearts on tweets that he likes. It's an important job.
I think it's kind of hard to really describe how much Twitter is messing with our country in this way. Not only are, this is a social media platform that most Americans
don't use it, and the people who do have it don't use it very often.
pay no attention to. They don't know. They don't care.
Nope.
But it's also the platform that basically every Hill staffer is looking at constantly. Every news producer is looking at constantly. If you watch back in the day when people were actually in studios together, during commercial breaks, what are the guests doing often? They're immediately pulling out their phone to see if anything popped on Twitter in response to what they just said. It is a weird subculture, but it's a weird subculture that is hyper influential within the policy-making elite. And then the other thing that helps make sort of the right crazy, Brian Riedel from the Manhattan Institute had these statistics. He was basically saying, if you took Twitter, the universe of Twitter users would be the most democratic state in the union. It would be Vermont or it'd be Hawaii. But if you get it down to the subset of power users on Twitter, that demographic is like the most democratic congressional precinct in America. So you're basically getting Barbara Lee's congressional district power tweeting. And so what then ends up happening is a lot of these right-wingers get kind of locked in this doom cycle.
Right.
Where this tiny beleaguered minority, we are losing. And what you are is a tiny beleaguered minority in one of the least used social media programs in the United States, but that by accident of history, the intellectual elite is disproportionately drawn to.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about state level policy, and I apologize for the bad transition there. I just had a thought and then was like, oh, I'm talking out loud. Okay. I am curious as to not just the influence of social media, but the influence of the nationalization of politics. Okay, so we've got your take here, but
My take on that is ugh.
I am curious as to that because we see local politicians and governors taking actions that are clearly aimed at a national audience, even if their actual audience really hates it. I think about how Ron DeSantis has been going, with regard to cruise ships, and cruise ships wanting to say, like, could we please check if people have COVID before they come on board? And Ron DeSantis says, no. And you have these cruise liners, which are obviously a massive business for Florida, being like, what? But no, we would really like to be able to do this because COVID on a cruise is very bad. But you see that he is appealing to an audience that is not people who work for the cruise industry, not people necessarily in Florida. If you talk to folks in Key West about dumping sewage or something, like you have these moments where politicians are making a play for a national audience. Is there something, is this a new phenomenon that's happened because of widening media? Or is it something that's happening more and we're just thinking more about it? And two, is there something that we can do about it or work with it? Because I think that it's impacting Democrats, where people think that AOC is the most powerful Democrat alive. She is not. She has actually very little relative power.
Yeah.
But I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
Well, the nationalization issue is a huge problem because what ends up happening is disputes over there end up influencing laws right here. in a way that's not rational for your location. So I'll give you a perfect example. If you're a hyper online conservative, there is a school board, and I talked about this in my talk this morning. Everybody knows Loudoun County Schools in Virginia and how crazy Loudoun County School. I was just in Loudoun County recently. Middleburg is lovely. I kept waiting for some CRT to jump out at me, and I just couldn't find it. But
I'm going to intersectionality
yeah,
so
there's
hard.
so much intersectionality in CRT everywhere. But the Loudoun County Schools, or the San Francisco Unified School District, does something crazy. And people don't actually really think quite like this. The firewalls against the San Francisco Unified School District becoming my school district are incredibly strong.
Right.
The thinking is today San Francisco, tomorrow Murray County, Tennessee, and that's just not in the cards. But then there's all this legislation, and I'm thinking about the anti-CRT legislation in states. That legislation, y'all, is utterly incoherent. It is utterly incoherent. In my home county, in Williamson County, Tennessee right now, there's a complaint against my school district for anti-CRT legislation, under the anti-CRT legislation, against the school district for using books like Dr. King Goes to Washington, or My Story of Desegregation by Ruby Bridges. And one of the objections is literally showing children the Norman Rockwell desegregation picture. Mm-hmm. That's not CRT, that's just history. But because everyone has been taught to look for CRT under every tree, through Twitter, through Fox, through talk radio, it has totally distorted local debate. And it's gotten vicious, it's gotten ugly, people's lives get threatened. It's extraordinary, and it's part of this, the nationalization, because the last thing we want is to become Loudoun County Schools, and so we're going to draw the line in the sand in Williamson County against Ruby Bridges, and it's very deeply toxic.
Yeah, I tweeted a lot about that because I was struck by how one of the people arguing against this was that, I don't want my child who is white to feel bad.
Yes.
Which I think that we want. Do you remember the boomlet of people getting worried about participation trophy culture?
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, we abandoned that very quickly. But Matt, you write a lot about very local issues in Washington, D.C., the city where we both live, a delightful place. Now, you write about Washington, D.C. in a way that I really like, which is not about Capitol Hill, but it's about D.C. Metro and what they should do. How do you think that talking about local politics can be good for understanding national politics?
Well,
and how do you do it effectively?
I think it is good, a positive change, I will say, in the media, because we've dwelled on the negative.
Yes.
A positive change is that you can have more media that is focused on communities of interest. So I write a lot about mass transit issues, and so do some other people on Twitter, on different publications, and people who love mass transit and who cover transit issues in different cities across the country are able to do so with a level of expertise about mass transit that local news beat reporters were not usually able to muster. Because if you were on the transportation beat at the Seattle Times, your goal in life is to get promoted to a better beat on the Seattle Metro desk, right? You weren't traditionally trying to make a career as a guy who knows about optimal bus route scheduling. So I like to write about that stuff. I'm really into optimal bus route planning and how transit works, and I'll tell people about Germany and fare integration. I love the bus rapid transit that you guys have here in Grand Rapids. It's absolute best practices station design with the level boarding. It's wonderful. So I like that kind of stuff. But what David said is completely correct, that we have slipped the psychic bounds of the nature of a federal system is that on some level you have to agree to not care about what's happening other places. And there's always, always, always a tension in that, right? Somebody was sitting around in 1958 saying, well, what business is it of yours, Yankee, if we have segregated schools? And you're gonna be no, it's Hubert Humphrey says we have to come out of the darkness of states' rights and into the light of human rights. And I think in retrospect, we all think that was correct. That being said, to decide that like everything that happens, like do you agree with a public school halfway around the country's approach to curriculum design? Like, is that a fundamental question of human rights? Or is it just that like there are inherently judgment calls in like how do you want to run a school system, and different communities are going to do different things, and you just like, you kind of gotta let them, right? You can't, but it's not just policy. I mean, David was talking about policy, but I just see so much angst, so much like upset that people in communities you don't live in have ideas that you don't agree with, and they're doing stuff that you wouldn't do, but it's not happening to you, right? And like everybody needs to be a little more, just try to be a little more grounded in reality. Like you can email your city council member and they will write you back in a way that like a senator won't. So if you pay attention to what happens in your city council and you decide to get upset that like maybe the bus routes aren't that good, you can complain about it and you will be efficacious, actually. People will respond to you. If you can get 20 neighbors together and write to your city council member, you will probably win the argument, right? And you can feel like politics is a way for citizens to influence the government and get their way. If you spend your time reading about the craziest guy in the Iowa State Senate, like your whole life is going to be miserable, and you're going to feel like politics doesn't work, like democracy is a joke. But that's because like you are poisoning your own mind with like toxic ill will that has nothing to do with you or your life.
You know, it used to be that it was a 9-alarm fire if somebody was wrong online. It's like, I'm sorry, Nancy, my wife, I'm not coming down yet for dinner. Somebody's wrong on Twitter. I got to deal with it. But now it's like, I'm sorry, somebody's wrong in America, and I've got to deal with it. And it worms into your brain. It just destroys your psyche and your emotions, and ultimately just damages your soul.
Sorry, I'm really trying to figure out where to go from that.
Yeah.
I do think it's curious because I was very annoyed about this particular school board attempting to ban these books, especially because I think that in many ways that project is farmed outward into different schools. But I do think that respecting the Federalist Project means assuming that San Francisco and Iowa City are going to do two very different things. And both of those things are fine. And if you live in one, you may not want to live in the other.
I also think it's weird. I always think that one reason David is such a sensible person is that he lives in like suburban Tennessee, which is where you would expect a conservative person to live. But so many conservative writers like live in New York, and then are very upset all the time, which is fine. I grew up in New York, and I don't really like it either, but so I don't live there.
No, there is a sense, I mean, it's the same thing, and I think about this a lot because there are lots of, like, there are pockets of blue and red states and pockets of red and blue states, because the blue state, red state thing, like, it doesn't quite work that way. Like, you can go to Thomas, West Virginia, and have a great time at a very LGBT-friendly art gallery. It's delightful. We got a bear painting from there. It was very nice. But like, you can have these times, but then you also have moments where it's like, if you know, most of the people, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and then it was a type of social conservatism that did not mesh with this whole thing going on over here, and so I left. And then I moved to Washington, D.C., the greatest place on earth. So I do think it's interesting how that kind of, we understand, like the conservatives who live in New York and DC know that they are there because that is where power, or the conceit of power is, but it means that they will never feel powerful there. Do you think that that's part of the point?
Oh, I think it messes with people's minds, to be honest, because you know, there's this old concept called Miles' Law. It was invented for bureaucracies, but it's where you stand is based on where you sit. In other words, the environment that you're around can't help but change the way you think in some important ways. And if you are constantly feeling like you're in a cultural minority, that you're in a political minority, And then if you're on Twitter all the time, so where you stand geographically or where you sit geographically, you're in a minority. Then when you go online, you're in a minority. I do think it messes with you, and it creates this declinist narrative that in many ways is really at odds with the facts in a lot of parts of the country. Just take Tennessee, for example. When I moved back to Tennessee after living in Philly in 2006, Tennessee was a kind of a purplish state. It had a Democratic governor, or Phil Bredesen had just been governor. It had a divided government. It had the House was Democratic. All of its policies were really moderate. Now you basically can't get elected in the state of Tennessee outside of Memphis, Knoxville, or Nashville unless you're videotaped praying with an AR-15 in each hand. I mean, it is unbelievable how conservative Tennessee has become. I mean, you know, people say we lose everywhere we live. I'm talking, what are you talking about? Tennessee has a trigger bill, and that means if the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, abortion is going to be unlawful in Tennessee. Tennessee is a constitutional carry state. As long as you can lawfully own a gun, you can carry it in the state of Tennessee. Tennessee has no state income tax and a constitutional amendment to prohibit it. I mean, you just go down the line. It's sort of like the conservatives in Tennessee. I think DJ Khaled wrote a song about them. All I do is win, win, win.
Yeah.
And so it does create a different perception than being in a jurisdiction all the time where all you do is lose, 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 lose.
But if that, I mean, do you think that that type of winning is even the point for many conservatives now? Because you were talking about, like, I think a lot of what Matt wrote in his piece, which is talking about, like, if conservatives thought that policy was so important, then the fact that Trump passed, you know, his major achievement was this tax cut and not the infrastructure week that we were promised but never got, or that the populism that was supposedly in opposition to conservatism was so popular would have been more of a problem, but it just seemed to be like, well, if he likes it, it's fine. If he doesn't, it's not fine. So do you think that because of that, you could have the reddest state in the union, but if at some point someone is permitted to watch a Lil Nas X video, that it's just not enough? They're still losing.
Well, that's the thing is what ends up happening is that something happens out there.
Yeah.
And then the demand is, what are you going to do in here? When the answer is, what do you want us to do? We're just going to make the rubble bounce. You know, the rubble of what used to be the Democratic Party. We're just going to, when Tennessee had its anti-CRT law, I was talking to an attorney in the governor's, attorney in the executive branch. And they kept questioning, where's the CRT in Tennessee? And all the examples that were coming in were from well outside of Tennessee. Well, we need to pass this really broad, really vague, really punitive law to prevent it from coming in. Well, the law does no such thing just as a matter of legal analysis, but that's a lot of what's happening. And then you have a lot of these governors. I'm very fortunate to live in a state where my governor is not auditioning for the national stage. But if you do live in a red state where the governor is auditioning for the national stage, then you have to deal with performative legislation. So this is the DeSantis-Abbott playbook, which is I'm going to pass blatantly unconstitutional legislation to regulate social media companies, for example. I'm going to pass blatantly unconstitutional legislation that lets Tucker Carlson know that I'm a fighter, but does nothing in the real world except generate legal fees for the ACLU as they knock these things down, and perpetuates amongst part of the Republican Party a view of the First Amendment as a problem, which is something that is just really jolting if you grew up like I did in the conservative legal movement. The First Amendment was the lodestar, not the problem, but it's now becoming a problem in some circles.
Do you think that that type of performative legislation has been problematic for Democrats as well, especially when you get into, like, when you're attempting to appeal to an audience that seems much bigger than it actually is?
I don't really think, I think there's an asymmetry there, right? And Democrats are much more oriented around their policy stuff. I mean, there's a reason this Biden bill is so big. Like, that really is what Democrats want to do. And, so I think Jay Inslee tried and failed to pass like the most ambitious package of climate legislation in Washington. Now that was his version of auditioning for the national stage. Obviously, Washington state cannot solve climate change. It's a global atmospheric issue. But there was a lot of substance to that bill, so much substance that it was rejected by the state legislature, and it then made it hard for him to run the presidential campaign that he wanted to run. But I do think that that's a somewhat different dynamic, that, you know, progressives are incredibly demanding, right? $1.5 trillion, that's peanuts. We want $3.5 trillion, right? These are really big asks. They're not posturing. They're, if anything, just overreaching, you know? And I think the kind of bubble dynamics go the other way, that, you know, people, you're under 40, you live in Brooklyn, you went to college, you hang out with other people who are under 40 and went to college and live in Brooklyn, and you're convinced that like everybody knows that Barack Obama was an ineffectual, hyper moderate, you know, Pete Buttigieg is practically a Republican, right? And the universe of reality, which is just that like there's a lot of right-wing people in America. And then, because there are so many right-wing people, policy is so right-wing in some states that there are a lot of people who are really moderate, who are just like, man, I'm a Democrat, because these Republicans are so right-wing, and they're voting for Joe Biden, they're voting for Eric Adams, you know, like they're not plugged in to this like super left educated space that does dominate our understanding, right? We don't have you guys don't like have at the Times a columnist who's like, I'm a Democrat, but I'm a little bit more conservative than Joe Biden. But like a lot of people in America are
Right.
like that. But they, to the extent that they exist in the Times world, it's like Bret Stephens and David Brooks playing that role. But like they're supposed to be conservatives. There's like lots of people who are just like solid, regular Democrats, but they work in the private sector and they go to church and they're just like a little rather than we should transform into Sweden.
Right. I think that that actually leads to my final question for both of you, which is about policy design. Because what I've noticed is that you see people when they're talking about infrastructure bills or they're talking about any sort of legislation, the idea is that it appeals to more people than you think it does. You've seen questions like, oh, well, 60% of people say they actually support this. And then when you look at the polling, it's like, will they support a piece of this or something like that? So both of you are smart people who have thought a lot about these things, maybe too much. But I'm curious as to, given with what we've talked about polarization, given with the conversations we've had, how would you shape policies to work in this context? Like, in which it's not enough to just be like, I just get things done, unless you are really running down ballot in a down ballot race. How do you adjust policies, design policies that can work and be popular in this era? I feel like that's an unintentionally extremely hard question, but I'm curious as to your thoughts. What do you think, Matt?
You know, I think that people should acknowledge that life in the United States of America is pretty good. This is one of the richest societies that has ever existed. That's not to say that there aren't any problems, but that those problems arise in the context of incredible prosperity and personal safety and liberty in most cases, and probably things that you do are going to have to be like pretty targeted in specific ways that you don't, lots of people who are the kinds of people we've been talking about, like brain poisoned by the internet, are like yearning for revolution. But really most people aren't. That like America has a lot of dysfunction in the like yelling space, but like life is pretty good. The pandemic was really bad. And so like tackling the pandemic is good. We have, an unusually high level of traffic fatalities. So if you can do some things at the margin to make our highways safer, like that would be helpful. But people don't want to see their lives and our society upended. And it's fine that there's like grim ideologues who have these grand projects, but politics traditionally has been about like keeping those grim ideologues in a box and listening to what it is people are saying and trying to be responsive to the real public instead of the shouting classes. And we've just been struggling. We've been promoting the shoutiest politicians rather than raising up the people who have a proven ability to like win people over and win tough races.
I don't think our primary problem right now in the United States of America is a policy problem.
I believe it's debate team energy. That's our biggest problem.
A lot of debate team energy. I would say that you're going to do a lot of good for this country in three ways. One is stability. This idea that we're going to lurch, that we're going to be in a constant crisis mode, that we're going to be lurching from crisis and controversy to crisis and controversy. Stability. Here's another one that's incredibly underrated: competence. Competence. Look, one of the things we can debate, we can have a really good faith debate about the decision of whether we should have withdrawn from Afghanistan. That is something that a lot of smart people of good faith have competing ideas about. The execution of that policy reeked of incompetence, just reeked of incompetence, and created a crisis that resulted in, that ultimately resulted not just in a panicked retreat from the country, but also the largest, I believe the third largest mass casualty event for American soldiers in the entire 20-year war. Competence is an underrated quality in leaders, and we demand it as a matter of course from a manager at a hardware store, or we demand it from our insurance agent, we demand it certainly from our doctors, our pilots, but somehow the more powerful a politician gets, the less important to us things like character and competence are. That's completely backwards. It's ridiculous. So stability, competence, and then the other thing that I would say is we need a devolution of power from the president to Congress, from Congress to the states, so that these grim ideologues, many of whom have some really interesting ideas that should be tried, have the ability to get it done without swinging for the fences to win all three win the House, win the Senate, win the presidency, get the judiciary at least aligned enough to where their laws can be upheld. That's a really heavy lift for reform when 80% of Americans live in states where the same party controls the governor's mansion, the upper house, and the lower house in the state. That's where you can really do some stuff. But we keep saying everything has to be national, all of our reform has to be national. Because Congress is broken, that means it has to come through the president. The president is checked by the courts and is somewhat, somehow checked by Congress. And 4 years isn't that long a time to do much of anything anyway, so everyone's always frustrated all of the time. So I say stability, competence, devolution of power, and you're going to make some progress in this country.
Okay, well, maybe we should just listen to you. David, Matthew, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, guys.
Awkward pause.
I actually have a question here on Zoom.
Okay, great.
This comes from Noreen Myers, who was one of our opening speakers this morning, or she introduced one of the panels. Last week, Thomas Edsall wrote an article entitled, "How Much Does How Much We Hate Each Other Matter?" in which he asked several scholars whether negative polarization predict anti-democratic attitudes. In other words, do depolarization interventions reduce support for undemocratic practices? Your opinions, please.
Oh, that's a good question. David, what do you think?
I think how much we hate each other matters a ton. And in this way, I think especially, so if you put in your, there's this great New York Times tool where you can put in your address and you can find out how red or blue your neighborhood is, not just your city or your town, but your literal, right where you live. And where I live is 85% Republican and about 10% Democrat. I'm sure that's exactly like
Yep,
Navy Yard.
yep, Washington DC,
Yeah.
very
And-
much.
And what I think hatred does is it makes you vulnerable to a lot of misinformation and conspiracy. So if you loathe your political opponent, if you believe they're an existential threat to the country, which is something that a lot of people believe about their political opponents, you're prone to believe and you're vulnerable to believing a lot of pretty wild things. And I think the Stop the Steal, the election conspiracy is rooted in that a great deal. You know, I can tell you, I mean, I debated this evangelical celebrity / thinker named Eric Metaxas a couple of times.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely, totally of the opinion that if Joe Biden wins, America is over. That's how malignant an influence that he is on the country. So if you believe that Joe Biden would destroy the United States of America, it's that you've made that leap in your mind. It's a light lift. It's a light lift to say that he would use the Democratic machine to change vote totals in 3 or 4 jurisdictions.
Can I interrupt just one? Do you think that he genuinely believes that, or do you think that he's aware that the audience he is trying to talk to wants to hear that?
Yes.
Because clearly, like, if you believe that the country is going to be overtaken, you would take different steps than trying to sell My Pillow advertising.
Well, he did take different steps.
That's true.
He led the Jericho March before January 6th. I mean, he was one of the principal. So a lot of people, they believe their own BS. And not in my experience, and I'd be interested in if you guys disagree, in my experience, there's not a huge number of people who spend a lot of time arguing beliefs that they don't ultimately convince themselves of. We have trouble living in that kind of tension. And I've looked Eric Metaxas in the face in the green room, and dude is convinced. He's not just convinced that Joe Biden would destroy America. He was utterly convinced that Donald Trump had a divine anointing from Jesus Christ to save the United States.
The thing that people don't do is they don't, so I read a woman named Julia Galef's book, Scout Mindset, and it's about, how to be better at seeing the world as it is, the way a scout is supposed to. And, one of the key techniques for that is if you're going to predict something, write it down and then look back and see if you were right and take stock in how good have your predictions be and change your assessment. And so many people I know sincerely believe that they have gotten everything right when it isn't true. And so one thing that I know happens, after January 6th, a lot of liberals I know who had been issuing dire prediction after dire prediction for 4 years of Donald Trump, they started saying after that, you see, the alarmists were right about everything all along. Because what happened is that the alarmists were right specifically about the events of 1 week in January. They actually were right. But they then convinced themselves that everything they had said for 4 years was right. But it seems like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin were not in a conspiracy to steal the 2016 election, which a lot of people said, but it seems like that probably wasn't true, right? And so people didn't come back to that with a you know what? Some of my alarmism was vindicated and some of it was not. And, people were saying, I remember the Dilbert guy. He was like, if
Scott
Biden
Adams.
wins,
Scott Adams, yeah.
conservatives are going to be hunted in the streets, right? And Dinesh D'Souza was saying the other day that this was like Tiananmen Square, that the media was going to black out conservatives, right? And so, look, 6 months from now, is AM Talk Radio still going to be full of conservative talkers? I think it will. I feel actually really confident about that.
Write it down,
but
Matt.
People will just blithely say this stuff, never look back, and they get spun up into more and more extreme takes. And I think David and Jane are both right. It's sincere, but it's also an act, right? People know it's way more fun to be this is the end, like it's all, the collapse is around the corner, than to be giving some like super diffident, like, it's really hard to say, Biden might do some really bad stuff, but also Kristen Sinema might not vote for it, and, who knows? Plus there's 6 conservative Supreme Court justices, and like, that's not a good, it's not good for clicks, right?
Yeah.
So you're incentivized to like work yourself up into the most ridiculous version of a defensible argument.
My favorite example of that was, some of you guys might know, I had this really bizarre interlude in the summer of 2019 where David Frenchism was a thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Culminating in a debate I had with the person who coined that term at Catholic University. He's a guy named Sorab Amari, who's the for now the editorial page editor in the New York Post. And a lot of it was really aimed at my lack of the Flight 93 mindset, that I did not feel like America was teetering on the brink of catastrophe. And I'll never forget in the Q&A section after the debate, somebody basically said, Bernie Sanders, this is when Bernie Sanders was, still considered this summer 2019, so Sanders is still a live player in all this, would send us to the Coliseum. And this was a statement delivered with an incredible amount of emotion attached to it and dripping in sincerity. And I said, Bernie Sanders doesn't have the ability to handle Mitch McConnell. It's a long way from the Coliseum. But that's literally not what the audience, a lot of members of the audience want to hear. They have primed themselves to believe that we're on the brink of catastrophe. And here's the interesting thing, especially in the Trump era, that belief is what enabled an awful lot of rationalization of what went on over the last 4 to 5 years. In normal times, we wouldn't want this guy, but these are not normal times.
You need a fighter.
He's a fighter. We have to fight. So things like the Southern Baptist Convention's statement on the importance of moral character in politicians, drafted in, drum roll please, 1998. Wonder what was happening then. Suddenly became not operative at all because the times were just so urgent. And so I think there was a deep psychic need to be told, you're doing the right thing, you're doing the right thing. We know that he's got problems, but you're doing the right thing because the times are so urgent. And where there was a demand for that message, the supply, there was a media supply.
I think we had another question back here.
Hi, David. First off, as a progressive-ish Christian, former evangelical, I appreciate the insight into Eric Metaxas because his change over the years has been very perplexing to me. So I appreciate the gaze into his eyes, description of that. I want to ask a question about the concept of kayfabe, if you're familiar with that. In wrestling, pro wrestling operates on that, but also reality TV in the sense of the blurring of the lines between the scripted and the real life lives of the performers, in the sense of like there's a willing suspension of disbelief on both the performance side and also on the audience side as to what is real. You go to like a wrestling event or you watch like, I don't know, the Kardashian show, and you know that like there are characters, but it's kind of real, the sort of blurring the lines. I was wondering if you could comment about that sort of, how much of that sort of willing suspension of disbelief, that sort of wink, wink, this is kind of a show, but it's real, characterizes the state of debate. And Jane, if you could, if there's a dunk on the Dallas Cowboys that you could supply for the group chat, because we're fans of you in there. That's the second part, second part. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think that David, perhaps you want to talk, because I think the more I learn about pro wrestling, the more I think that the kayfabe concept is really helpful. Like when you have this moment, like when something is, like people are fighting, and I think that goes to what we were talking about, the green room concept, where it's like people are screaming at each other and then they go back and it's like, it's a job, it's a business. But I am interested in, David, into your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't like to brag, Jane, but I have seen Andre the Giant wrestle Hulk Hogan in live and in person at Rupp Arena in Lexington, Kentucky with 20,000 screaming fans. So I'm quite familiar with kayfabe.
Right.
Have participated enthusiastically because it felt real to me. I would say, and look, Donald Trump is quite familiar with this. I mean, don't forget, he was in WrestleMania.
I believe he's in the WWE Hall of Fame.
He made he was in WrestleMania. He helped shave Vince McMahon's head on
Yep.
live television after defeating him in a wrestling match. So I think there was a lot of kayfabe, and it was kayfabe until it wasn't, okay, is the way I would put it. It's sort of it was performance art. There were a lot of people who were kind of along for the ride, enjoyed it as entertainment. I think a lot of the rallies had a big WWE sort of energy and vibe about them. And that was there. It was sort of like this concept of take him seriously but not literally. Part of that was the kayfabe notion, until it was real, until it was very real. And that was moving into the pandemic, when decisions began to be extraordinarily consequential, and then of course the election contest. So there was nothing, after a while there was nothing wink wink, nod nod about what was happening. It was all pure, raw, real energy.
I have nothing cruel to say about the Dallas Cowboys that has not already been done by the Dallas Cowboys to fans of the Dallas Cowboys. That's all I have to say on that matter. I think that there is another question over here, yellow shirt right here. Dak Prescott seems nice though. So
SEC, Mississippi State Bulldogs.
I'm aware.
That is hard to follow up. Simple question, how important do you think nuance is to public discourse? And if so, how do we get it more into the mainstream of public discourse?
I think it's integral, and I think that that's one of the challenging things about social media is that it's inherently flattening, so there is no nuance and there is no context. An idea is emitted in, I mean, it's why, like, how many times have people gotten yelled at because of one tweet that was actually part of a tweet thread, which I know is like, even talking about Twitter with your mouth sometimes just feels bizarre. Yeah. It just sounds like I'm just making up words, but I'm not. I am saying things. But yeah, I think it's integral, which is why I think that something that I am trying to do more of, and I think it's just because I happen to be this kind of person, is being more willing to say I don't know, or that I would need more information, or that maybe, which are all deeply unsatisfying answers. I think someone asked me a really great question yesterday about debate and the ideas of being debated, but what, like, for if you're trans and people are talking about, or LGBT more broadly, and people are talking about issues that impact you, how do you handle these debates? And I'm like, if I knew the right answer, I would tell you, but I don't. And I'm trying to figure this out myself. So I think that being willing to be nuanced yourself in conversations, like, I am not sure about a lot of things. I spend a lot of life being like, oh, I need to read more about this. I have a whole list of subjects about which I had more information, and then I would talk more about them. And I always look stuff up, and then I'm like, well, I'm still confused. So I think being willing to be nuanced to yourself, or saying like, well, I read something on this, but I'm not quite sure. And I think that there is this idea, especially for women, that in order to like lean into the conversation, you need to like kind of pretend as if you have more information than you do. But as a human being, I don't want to do that. That sounds deeply unpleasant. I would rather just be unsure.
So I think that humility, a la what Jane was saying there, is really underrated.
Yeah.
I think that nuance can be a double-edged sword, that there's an important role for nuance in life, and it sounds good, but one thing that I see is like, somebody will say or do something dumb, and then people who are on the other side will be like, yo, that was dumb. And then people who are on the side of the person who did the dumb thing will not want to concede any weakness, right? They're warriors in the war of ideas. And then nuance can be the tool through which, oh, that apparently dumb thing was like really not
Actually,
dumb, right?
secretly very
but
smart.
the fact is that, you know, there's 330 million people in America. So almost nobody's on Twitter. So that's still 20 million people. So, you know, half of them are on your side. They're saying 15 things a day. Like, just people, good people who are on your side say and do dumb stuff, like every day. That's just life, right? And you can sort of like be the nuanced lawyer to make it seem like nothing bad has ever happened or nobody was ever wrong about anything. And that's its own kind of a trap. And I think is different from the correct point Jane was making, that a lot of time the answer is like, I don't really know, you know? It's not clear to me what's going to happen, which are just like, that's not good content.
Nope.
But like, it's still the correct answer.
Nope, it's bad content, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, especially when we're talking, so much of what we're talking about, for example, what's the right policy in the Middle East, just to sort of, set of American policies. One of the fastest ways to know if somebody knows what they're talking about or not is if they're walking into this and saying, I've got the plan.
You did
You
it.
figured it all out, yeah.
Wait a minute.
You cracked it.
But I do think acknowledging complexity and difficulty is number one, it's just honest. And number two, it's a great way to start to build bridges to have conversations.
Agreed. Question?
I would like to know if David likes the idea of 1 billion Americans.
Oh, yes, I do.
Boom, solved, it's done.
And why?
Yeah, yes, I do.
We got books outside. So.
Yeah. I've written about the issue, for example, of fertility decline and the problems that fertility decline presents to a culture. So I think there are two things that we should be trying to do at once. One is to bolster family formation to the extent that we can, but acknowledge that all across the world, developing societies have had real trouble using government policy to bolster fertility rates. But to the extent that the government can do no harm or that it can actually do something good, I'm very much in favor of public policy that bolsters family formation. It makes it easier to have and raise children, which is one of the reasons why I was a big fan of the Romney Child Allowance Plan, for example. And I think the Biden plan is more of a BB plus compared to the Romney plan. So number one, bolster family formation. But number two, I'm a believer in immigration as a means of driving economic and cultural vitality. And look, I think there's a lot of people who are running around saying that they know what America will be like if we have more immigrants who don't know what they're talking about, to be honest. Let's just take, for example, there's a lot of panic on the right on this thing that Tucker talks about replacement theory, white replacement theory, that here come all of these voters, that are non-white voters and they're going to be part of the Democratic coalition forever. Well, what's coming in is an awful lot of pretty devout, believing Christians coming in from Central America, from South America, and they're not necessarily fitting in real super neatly in these right-left sort of culture wars that we are engaged in. They're unpredictable consequences, and we're sitting there trying to sort of keep out what we know that a lot of what smart immigration does, which is increase economic and cultural vitality of the country, because of what we don't really know, which is the long-term political partisan impact of it, or a lot of fears about the long-term partisan political impact. Look, I grew up in the Reagan era, and what was imprinted into my DNA as a young conservative was, we are proud of the fact that people want to come here. Like I remember in the Olympics, one of the ways we owned the Soviets is by bringing in Warsaw Pact people and they became American citizens. And we're like, yeah, Martina Navratilova, go destroy the communists on the tennis court. You're an American now, awesome. And so I really grew up in this, where it's imprinted in my DNA that the desire of people, now it doesn't mean you have open borders. Nobody really advocates that, but this desire for people to come here, that's something we're supposed to be proud of, legitimately proud of. So yeah, I was, we disagree on a lot of things, but the energy and vitality of 1 billion Americans, I think that I'm on board with that.
Fantastic.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone. This was great and really appreciate your time.